Don't fall for the Warmongers Propaganda. That's the subject of this episode of the What's Wrong with America podcast, Monday, February 28th, 2022. Hope you guys are doing well. Got a lot of stuff going on in the world. And it seems like we go from crisis to crisis these days. You know, it used to be you'd have a crisis. Usually the elites would figure out a way to milk that crisis for all that it's worth, get people, get the working class like scared and divided among themselves and fighting some stupid culture war over something kind of tangential while they just made off with all the money, I've heard it said that they keep us fighting they keep us fighting a culture war so that we don't fight a class war. But what's weird is just as time has gone on, it's almost like, I don't know if they're just getting greedier or what, or maybe it's the fact that I don't know what it is, but it's like now we're going from just crisis, or in some cases manufactured crisis to manufactured crisis to another crisis. So, you just look at the last, I think the last thing that was a real crisis, obviously, since the beginning of this millennium, right? You got 9/11. So this was after Y2K, which turned out to really not be anything. So you had Y2K, in which they were like, oh, the satellites are going to fall from the sky, the banks are going to stop working, you're not going to be able to get any money, you're not going to be able to do shit, the modern society is going to collapse. Turned out not to be the case. What else happened? There was, of course, the September 11th. That was a pretty big deal. And that led to the Patriot Act, a whole lot of expansion of the, surveillance state and the, intelligence, military industrial complex, and war in Afghanistan, which that was one thing, because that's where bin Laden was hanging out. Of course, we kind of gave the Saudis a pass, even though they supplied most of the hijackers to Al-Qaeda. But, then, I don't know. It seemed like we stayed in Afghanistan a lot longer than we should have. The objectives for when we would say, all right, we did what we came to do weren't really all that clear. Probably should have left after we got bin Laden, but I don't know. But anyway, Iraq, obviously, that was based on a bunch of lies, and we never should have even gone in there. And then, then there's a financial meltdown, 2008, 2009. And of course, what's the response from that? The Fed just goes berserk. They had been printing a bunch of money before then. If you go to, there's a website, WTF happened in 1971. And it's either .org or .com. Let me just check that out so that I'm not sending you to the wrong place. But Whiskey Tango Foxtrot. Yeah, WTF happened in 1971.com. You can see a graph. 1971, what happened? Well, we went off the gold standard in 1971. You can kind of see how productivity and compensation kind of got decoupled after that point. Wages have not kept up with inflation, which inflation has been pretty high, since then. It wasn't as high. It was especially high in the 70s, not as high in the 80s. Reagan and Paul Volcker, I think is his name, got inflation under control, raised interest rates, all that sort of stuff, right? Inflation really kicked off again, though, after 2008. I mean, it was still high compared to what it had been before 1971, but after 2008, it's like the Fed just let loose. And these emergency measures to get, the economy back, to, bail out the banks, who, interestingly enough, the banks had just, in 2005, the banks sponsored, all the biggest Wall Street banks and consumer banks sponsored these changes to the Bankruptcy Act, right? To the bankruptcy laws, to make it harder for ordinary people to get through bankruptcy, and discharge their debts. Like, it made it actually harder for ordinary people to do it. And then they turn around in 2008. It's like, please bail us out or we torpedo the economy, So anyway, the Fed, of course, like, they just printed a ton of money, bought a bunch of their distressed assets that nobody else wanted, while times are good, it's capitalism and it's, profits for me because I took risks and I worked hard fucking people over. And then as soon as the bets go bad and it's like, oh shit, we don't have enough to cover our losses. Hey, we're too big to fail, right? What's good for the banks and Wall Street is good for America, right? Please bail us out. And then they get the money and just pay themselves a bunch of bonuses and dividends and don't, and still go ahead and foreclose on everybody's houses and all that. Right? So that's what happened 2008, 2009. Then there's like, the CIA sponsoring color revolutions abroad and Libya, Syria. What else? There's the, Black Lives Matter, the Ferguson riots, all that sort of stuff. It's a lot of domestic unrest. Then with Trump's presidency, there's this freaking out throughout the media and political establishment of like, oh, he's the next Hitler, he's doing this, he's doing that. Turns out a lot of that was just false, bunk, like the Steele dossier was complete garbage. Everything was manufactured by the Clinton campaign and the DNC. And even to the point of them using Ukraine, to like help establish, groups in Ukraine to help establish links between the former Soviet Union and the Trump campaign by creating backlinks and a bunch of crazy stuff, right? Like Crooked Hillary, well, that turned out to be a very apt nickname for her. So the whole time Trump's in office, there's this BS stuff about Russiagate, which turns out to be completely false, just a complete fabrication, a product purely of the Democratic Party and the Clinton campaign. Then COVID comes. And COVID, it's like, turns out, COVID was not a good thing to get. And if you were older or if you had comorbidities, like you're really overweight, then it could be dangerous to you. But for the most part, if you're under 60 and you're relatively healthy, it's no worse than the seasonal flu. Well, that's, true. And yet, we acted like it was the worst thing since, like, the Spanish flu of 1917. Like, this is going to kill so many people. And, of course, in the aggregate, you can point to stats. Well, just many people did die of COVID. Now, of course, there's stuff about how did they count these numbers. As it turns out, if you're a gunshot victim, or you died of something else, but you also had tested positive for COVID, well, you're counted as being killed by COVID because apparently there's an incentive. The hospitals can make more money that way or whatever, right? So there's some questions about how many people that allegedly died of COVID, how many really died of COVID and how many died of other things. Maybe COVID contributed to it. I don't know, but there's a whole lot of fishy shit going on with the COVID stuff. But here's the thing. With COVID, that was starting to peter out, right? They'd done what they could to advance the cause of the Great Reset using COVID as a pretext. These lockdowns. And it really came to a head, I guess, the Canadian truckers. We have them to thank for it because they, said enough is enough. Like, why are we still living in lockdowns? We've got the vaccines. If that's what we were supposed to be waiting on, well, we've had the vaccines, And most people are vaxxed by this time, but yet there's still all these lockdowns. There's still like this, you must get vaccinated. Why? If you're vaccinated and the vaccines work so well, and especially if you're wearing masks on top of that and the masks work so well, then why do you care if I'm vaccinated or not? Like, seems like it shouldn't matter. For the record, I'm vaccinated. I don't know now, that would I make that decision to get vaccinated again? I don't know, given how much shenanigans were pulled around the whole thing with vaccines. But anyway, so it's like, it started to become clear with the footage from the Canadian trucker convoy protest that, all right, this crisis, in air quotes, crisis, is really run its course. There's not really a good reason to keep people locked down or any of that. Maybe there never was, but there's certainly not now. And it's like, Trudeau, people can just see how dishonest it all was, right? He's sitting there calling, these are some white supremacists and some, the fringe minority that holds unacceptable views. They're domestic terrorists. We need to invoke a state of emergency. And yet you see on the people live streaming, or you see the, objective coverage from the non-corporate regime approved media, you see like, oh, this is actually like a pretty multicultural protest. You see Sikhs, Indian Sikhs, you see native indigenous Canadians, you see black Canadians, you see people of all different backgrounds out there. And they're not, maybe there was like there were probably in all the thousands and thousands and thousands of people that were out there protesting, there's maybe a handful that could have, for all we know, been a plant, a false flag, just like the Lincoln Project's thing with the Glenn Youngkin campaign, where they had these, quote, white supremacists with tiki torches standing outside Youngkin, campaign. And they were so convincing as white supremacists. But anyway, so maybe that's what it was. You had a handful of people that had Confederate flags or whatever, but the protesters themselves didn't want any part of that, and in fact would push those people away. You just look at, there's no way you could look at this protest and say, oh yeah, it's clearly there's a bunch of white supremacists out there. When most of the people, again, it's like you actually see the video being live streamed, and it's like, oh wow, you have indigenous, people leading these kind of like ceremonies that people, and how is this all white supremacist and terrorists or whatever? Like, it didn't match up at all. People could see that, okay, this is a bunch of shit. COVID is just a fraud. It's a pretext being used to just take people's rights away, take people's right to peaceably assemble, for redress of grievances. It's in the United States is a basic constitutional right, but Canada, it's just supposed to be part of just being free. You being able to voice your opinion politically, your criticism of the ruling elite, right? Gather together peaceably to do that. Basic value, of classical liberalism. But, you see what the left has become. Not liberal, very fascistic, communistic, totalitarian, whatever, right? So COVID had run its course. So now, how coincidentally enough, as there's a trucker convoy making its way to D.C., as the truckers' protest has spread to other countries, time for a war. Let's get a war going. The whole thing with the war, and this is what, at this point, I don't know. So I'm not going to comment a lot about it, except to say the whole thing just seems off to me. Just again, because it feels very much like the beginnings of COVID. Think back to February and March 2020. The stories, the images coming out of China about the COVID, pandemic, and how lethal it was, how terrifying it was. Like, you have these images of like just bodies, and it looked like there was like this lethal pandemic. Not that COVID didn't kill people, but just I'm talking about lethal in the level of like a 50% fatality rate or something like that. Like, we're talking like the Black Plague of whatever, the 16th century, 15th or 17th century. I don't know when it was. Yeah, 15th century, I guess. Right? You had the Black Plague in Europe. It killed like half the population. That's what it was projected to be. It's like, oh, this is just going to be lethal. It's, killing all these people. Are going to have to build emergency hospitals to take care of all the sick and dying. They're going to, there's going to be a shortage of ventilators. There's going to be a shortage of graves. They're going to just have to dig these mass graves. It's basically like what they were trying to get people to think, so they shut everything down, except for the essential businesses that happen to be the big corporate stores and the online retailers, coincidentally enough, the stuff owned by the billionaire class and the Wall Street banks and all that. Not your mom and pop stores. Those need to shut down because they were not essential, Right, so anyway, it feels very much like that, though. That same messaging, that same propaganda that we experienced, that the psyops, basically, that we experienced in February and March of 2020, feels very much like what's been going on now with Ukraine and Russia. And so I'm not a Russia expert at all. I've read up lately on some stuff, just like probably a lot of people have. There's a great Substack that presents an interesting perspective, Fisted by Foucault, by Nicolo Soldi, or Soldo, Nicolo Soldo, Fisted by Foucault. You can just Google that, Fisted by Foucault Substack. Great stuff. That he's an interesting writer. He's actually from the former Yugoslavia. He was a refugee back during the Cold War era. And so he kind of has some, like, this is the perspective of somebody who still has some ties to like family or whoever still living in the former Soviet Union. And like kind of this is he gives without endorsing it, but just say like this is kind of how Putin sees this, and it really helped to make sense of for me, like why does Putin want to invade Ukraine? And as it turns out, which I knew was the case. I mean, I knew that there had to be a method to the madness. Again, not saying that I agree with it, not saying that he should invade Ukraine, because if I was Ukrainian, I would be up in arms, literally, trying to fight off the Russian invasion. And my hats off to the Ukrainians who are doing that. They seem to be doing so very bravely. But it's not like he's just some crazy, because this is the messaging that we're getting right now, is that Putin is basically this Hitler type person who just wants to expand Russian territory, conquer the world, rule the world, because he's this bloodthirsty dictator, right? And I'm not saying again that he's not a demagogue, but to say that that's all this is, it's as one-dimensional as that, sounds very much like, again, the messaging, early stages of COVID, or the messaging back in 2003 with Iraq. Oh, we got to go in because Saddam is this evil person. They hate us for our freedom. If we got to fight them there so that they don't fight us here, right? You heard that line from Bush. Well, now we're hearing that line from Congressman, I believe Adam Schiff was the one that said it. Or maybe it was Eric Swalwell. I get these guys mixed up because they're all full of shit and sound the same after a while. But no, I mean, that's what you hear now. You hear people literally saying the same thing. We got to go fight the Russians in Ukraine so that we don't have to fight them here. Like, what? Who's talking about Russia invading the United States? And while you're talking about Russia invading the United States, how about the actual, illegal immigrants that are, maybe you could consider that a form of invasion, right? If we don't know who's coming into our country, if just anybody and everybody from anywhere in the world wants to come through our southern border, they can do it, Again, this is not a knock on people that want to make a better life for themselves, and they see, hey, if I go to the United States, I can earn a lot more money, raise the standard of living for my family and my kids and give them a better future. Hey, I get that. I understand it. I wish that the path for legal immigration would be improved so that we could get more people who are wanting to be here to, realize the American dream. But you got to secure the border and know who's coming in and, I mean, it's crazy to me that with the left, all the draconian sort of stuff that they want or wanted with COVID, right? Locking people in their homes, not letting people go out, unless you're protesting for a cause they approve of, in which case, by all means, go out, protest for Antifa and Black Lives Matter, all you want. That's not going to spread the virus. But, despite all that, like the restrictions they wanted to put on the regular American people, they don't care who's coming across the border, whether they're vaccinated or not vaccinated, whether they're COVID positive or not COVID positive. Just come across the border. We'll ship you in the middle of the night. We'll not ship you. We'll fly you wherever you want to go in the United States. We'll just drop you off in some red state. Hopefully you'll help to change the demographics so that we can stay in power, without rigging the elections too badly. It's crazy to me that, again, why are we caring about Ukraine's border when we don't even care about our own border, right? Why are we, and this is the thing, it's like I support the people of Ukraine, Godspeed, wish them the best, but that's not our fight. There's so many things here in the United States that we need to focus on that we're not focusing on. And I just don't trust the people who now are telling me, we must focus on Ukraine. It is a vital necessity that we focus on Ukraine. It's like, well, you're the same people that have been telling us not to worry about those same things here in the United States. So why all of a sudden should we care about them halfway around the world in Ukraine where we don't have like an obvious national interest? I mean, let's be honest. Ukraine they talk about it like it's this democracy. It's a very corrupt government in Ukraine. We sponsored a color revolution in Ukraine in 2014, and the same jackasses that are pushing for war now with Russia were then saying, regime change, Putin, Putin's next, Russia's next, like basically announcing this is where this is going to lead. So Putin, he's seeing Ukraine as like NATO's expanding up to the Russian border, wanting, if NATO expands its influence into Ukraine and is allowed to install, say, missiles there, imagine China making a deal with Russia or Canada and putting missiles on our border, right? We'd freak the fuck out, or we should, So it's like, yeah, Ukraine again, it's just it does not to say I support Putin. I don't. I hope the Ukrainians are successful, those fighting for their freedom. But the idea that Putin is just doesn't have any reason for doing what he's doing, well, that's just a sure way to make sure that we don't learn from this either. Just like we didn't learn from Iraq, apparently, for the same people that brought us the war in Iraq with the same propaganda, the same lies, the same messaging, are now doing the same thing with this. And they're succeeding in swaying a lot of people, it appears. So my thing with this is not to argue one way or the other for what Ukraine, who's right, who's wrong with the Ukraine and Russia thing, or what we should exactly do. How much aid should we give the Ukrainians? I don't know. How should we aid them? Again, I don't know. I think we got to be careful careful to avoid war, like a full-scale hot war with Russia. That's not going to be in anybody's best interest. I mean, even in spite of all the wokeness and trying to understand white rage and all that, our military is still the best in the world. And so, yeah, we could win, but at what cost, right? Like, you're going to lose, a few American cities and a bunch of people in the process of like a nuclear holocaust, to prove that we're right and we're stronger. I don't know. I mean, maybe that's what the Great Reset globalists want. They want depopulation, and they're not shy about saying it, that the humanity is the enemy of humanity, right? And talking about population control. Like, that's the thing with the Great Reset. WEF, Whiskey, Echo, Foxtrot, the World Economic Forum, at WEF on Twitter, right? They're not shy about saying the stuff that they are wanting to bring to pass, Of course, if you take them at their word and say, oh, this is what they're planning, you're accused of being a conspiracy theorist. So maybe war with Russia, a nuclear war, is part of their plan for their Great Reset, destroying capitalism, destroying, the livelihoods and lives of much of the world's population. They got their bunkers, apparently, so who knows? But here's the thing, is this bottom line is like, at this point, it's not even that I would say I have any particular expertise about geopolitics, especially concerning that part of the world. I don't. All I know is the same people that lied to me before about Iraq, about the financial crisis, about these color revolutions in Libya and Egypt and Syria, the same people that lied to me about COVID, the same people that lied to me about Trump and Russia, collusion. Those same people are now the ones telling me, oh, we got to go to war with Russia over Ukraine. We got, like, some of these folks that are even talking about, like, we need to enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Like, great. That's not going to lead to an escalation, lead to an all-out war, right? Because what are we going to do? You enforce this. And this is a Democratic congressman proposing this, saying, we need to enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Well, it sounds good, but this is not Syria. This is not the Syrian Air Force or the Egyptian Air Force or whatever. This is Russia, which maybe they're not as good as us, but they're not Syria or Egypt either. They're also, they got nukes, including a lot of nukes aimed at the United States. So yeah, is that worth it to because how are we going to enforce that without shooting down Russian planes that violate our no-fly zone, right? So you shoot down a couple of Russian aircraft. You don't think that's going to lead to retaliation? Again, it's like, and I don't know, people are proposing this. Are they just swept up in the hysteria and just promoting it, like it takes on a life of its own? I mean, that's what seems to happen when you have a crowd, a mob, a herd of people stampeding one way or the other. It's like people just get carried away and don't even think about the consequences tomorrow, right? That's how you have people thinking, oh, we're going to improve the lives of black people living in poor communities by destroying all the mom and pop stores in that community. Now, maybe, and some may be owned by white people living outside of the community, sure. Not to say that makes it right to burn down the business, but there were plenty of businesses that black owned, had Black Lives Matter stuff, but they still got burned down, right? So it's like now you're saying, well, we want to improve the community, the lives of these black people living in this community. We're just going to burn down all the mom and pop stores and also burn down the big box stores too. We're just going to burn everything down. So that way there's no place to shop. If you want groceries, the same people that will bemoan the, quote, food deserts that exist in certain low-income communities, right? By food desert, meaning like there's not any grocery stores where you can get fresh produce or stuff like that. You got to go to these, like, get heavily processed food at, like, a little corner store or, gas station or whatever, like convenience store. I mean, it's just not good food options. Those same people are, like, promoting and celebrating riots, burning down the grocery stores, right? So it's like, how's that improving people's lives? Well, that's what happens when you get people in a herd and they're just stampeding in one direction or the other, especially when they're inflamed by fear, anger, and this one-dimensional sort of moralizing about, like, we're the good guys, we're on the right side of history, they're the bad guys, they're evil, right? You get people to do pretty much anything, and that's what it seems like is going on with this whole push for war with Russia over Ukraine. It's like, again, once somebody has lied to you, and you see that they lied to you, you see they're basically a sociopath, that they will lie with a straight face, a smile on their face. They'll lie pretending to be your friend while they're lying to you. They're robbing you blind, right? Like, how many times do you need to fall for it before you realize, okay, I can't trust a thing that this person says. If they tell me that the sky is blue, chances are the sky is red. If they tell whatever, like, they are not a trustworthy person. These same people, brought us the war in Iraq, which turned out to be a complete sham based on nothing but lies. And why? Well, it's not hard to guess when you see some of the people made a ton of money off of Iraq. Not the American people, but a few, rich people who own or are tied to the defense industry, the military industrial complex, whatever, right? Your people that shareholders or executives at, Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and Boeing and KBR, places like that, right? Like, they made a ton of money. So it's not hard to see why they would want a war. And the same people that told us about Iraq are now telling us about this. The same people that told us about COVID are now telling us about this. And this is the one thing, man, that brings people on the right and left together. You got a bipartisan support for this war. We got to, if you're not a patriot, you're a traitor to the American people, to the United States Constitution. If you don't support war halfway around the world to protect the border of Ukraine, to protect the sovereignty of Ukraine, well, what about the sovereignty of the American people? What about our border? Huh? I mean, the same people, and this is, again, hard to really get on board with it, when, again, some of the same people that on the left, particularly, who were telling us, like, parents going to school board meetings to protest the teaching of, like, critical race theory or mandates, mass mandates for kids or whatever. Those parents are white supremacists and domestic terrorists and whatever else, and we need to get the FBI, literally, the FBI, targeting these parents for just exercising their right as parents to go before a government body and tell them how they feel about what that governing body is doing, the school board. In many cases, they're elected. Maybe in some cases, they're appointed. But regardless, they're appointed by elected officials. This is a government agency. That's your basic right, to go to a government agency that's holding a public meeting and voice your opposition to what they're doing. That is as basic a right as it gets. And yet, the same people that wanted us to label them domestic terrorists and put the FBI on them, surveilling them and harassing them, those same people are now telling us, it's so important to protect freedom in Ukraine. Like, give me a fucking break. You don't give a shit about freedom. You don't give a shit about borders. You just give a shit about something. I don't know quite what you're up to, but you're up to something. I don't trust you, right? That's how I feel about this. These same people, they're used car salesmen. They fucked us over before trying to sell us a lemon with the Iraq war. They tried to fuck us over selling us a lemon with this whole bailout for the banks and the response to the financial crisis of 08-09, which did nothing but reinflated the asset bubble that has enriched the wealthy, the billionaire class, the bankers at the expense of everybody else. And now that inflation is taking hold more broadly in the economy, not just the financial assets, but like consumer goods, and people are really seeing it, And now people are seeing that this whole COVID thing was a lie. That was another lemon they sold to us. And coincidentally enough, COVID also provided, with all the measures that were in place for that, an opportunity for the billionaires to vastly increase their wealth at the expense of everybody else. Right? So what do you think this is going to be? If that's their track record, is selling us on these crises, one crisis after another, manufactured or real, doesn't matter. They take advantage of it. They use it to transfer wealth into the hands of the very elite class and to fuck everybody else over and get us used to having less freedom, less prosperity, less of everything good. What do you think they're going to do with this? Do you really need to know a whole lot about this former Soviet Union and the politics and history of that region to know this is not a group that you can trust? So if they're telling us we need to go to war with with Ukraine over in Russia, chances are they're lying again. So don't fall for the war propaganda, right? That's all this is. Don't fall for the propaganda. Try to get a balanced set of views. Listen to people who are giving some nuance, in their explanation or their analysis. Glenn Greenwald is a good one. He's got a Substack that's great. Again, Fisted by Foucault by Nicolo Soldo, also great. Look at people like that and get more of a view of it. And don't fall for the propaganda, this false sense of urgency that, this is a threat to, the American people? No, the threat to the American people would come if we foolishly get into a hot war with a nuclear superpower, right? That's the danger to the American people, not whether Russia takes out Ukraine. I mean, again, you can be pro-Ukrainian people, but also acknowledge this ain't our fight, okay? We need to take care of our own home, get our own house in order before we go around the world telling other people, how they need to interact and live and what their arrangements need to be, right? It's like we still have not learned from the past 30 years of regime change operations in other parts of the world, trying to to what end, So bottom line is, these people can't be trusted. Don't buy their propaganda. Just try to remain calm. If you got a spiritual program, try to focus on that. Pray to God, read the Bible, read the Tao Te Ching, or meditate. Whatever it is you do to center yourself, to connect with a higher power, do that. And don't fall for the propaganda. All right, my name is Daniel D. This is the What's Wrong with America podcast. It is Monday, February 28th, 2022. I don't have a sponsor. Well, I do, but I forgot to do the ad read early in the podcast, and I'll just go ahead and release it as is. So the only thing I ask you to do is, if you like the podcast, share it, subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes, but let other people know about it, And if you don't like it, well, keep that to yourself. No, I'm just kidding. If you have some feedback, let me know too okay, so here's my email address, wwwapodcast@gmail.com. Again, that's wwwa for What's Wrong with America, wwwapodcast@gmail.com. Send me an email if you agree, disagree. Let me know in the comments if you're on social media. Anyway, hope you guys have a great week, and I'll talk to you later.